you can enter a question into the chat, or folks can unmute themselves towards the end. We'll do a Q&A, and I'd love to hear some voices other than mine. I've been doing these talks for a while now, and so I've kind of like has my eye on bear-related news, and noticing that pretty much every week there's some sort of like nutty bear story in the news, which I just think is so interesting. This week I just read about something called a pizzly bear. I don't know if people are familiar with a pizzly bear. It sounds like something you might eat at the end of tea time. But in fact, it is a hybrid between a polar bear and a grizzly bear. So it's much more likely to eat you after tea time than the other way around. And other stories that have been big lately, there's one that made the rounds recently about cocaine bear. This is a bear that got into a drug smuggler's stash of cocaine, like 75 pounds of cocaine that he was smuggling into the country. And of course, the bear got into it and had quite an experience. And then there's also, I saw recently this polar bear hotel in China. And the idea there is that they built a hotel around an enclosure that has a couple of polar bears in it. So at all times you can kind of like look from your hotel room at the polar bears and see what they're up to, which seems very nice for the humans and not so nice for the bears. But when I see these stories, I'm always reminded time and again of how bears are really something that we kind of like project ourselves onto, right? Bears are just one of these species that sometimes we think of them as very cute and cuddly, like a teddy bear. Sometimes we think very comic bumblers, like Baloo from the Jungle Book. Sometimes they're very fierce, like a bear at the end of the bad guy at the end of a horror film or something like that. And sometimes we think of them as these sort of noble, pure representations of the wilderness. And so that's really struck me over the course of the past year or so, is that we just tend to anthropomorphize them, put some tropes onto their shoulders. And what we don't often realize is that when we project those sorts of images onto a bear, we humans can actually change the behavior of that bear through policies that reflect those images and through our culture and how we interact with the bears. And that is what we're going to talk about tonight a little bit. That's what happened in Grafton during something called the Freetown Project. But before I really get into that, I just want to thank a couple of people here. As you came in, you heard this lovely singing by Heather Johnson. Heather did that song as part of a song contest that we did to celebrate the launch of the book. She's an amateur musician in Seattle, I believe. And we did a song contest called Musician Walks into a Bear. And that was her entry. So thank you to Heather. Thank you to Anne and the Hooksett Public Library. We will thank Ben Franklin, the founding father of the American Library System. And I'll also thank cheetahs. So cheetahs are like bears. And also I want to say, if you have this talk coming up next week from what was it, Don Allen about fish, brook trout? Yeah, if you want to find another species that people project themselves into and mess around with their culture, look no further than the fish. I can't think of another more controversial set of animals than the way that we manage our fish runs and fish in this country. It's really, really fascinating stuff. But the cheetah is a really amazing animal. You can see this cheetah here. It's kind of like flying over the ground. When a cheetah gets up to top speed, it can cover 23 feet with every stride, which is just kind of amazing. It just sails over the ground. It's as close as you can get to flying without having actual wings. And people know that it's very, very fast, but they don't often appreciate that a cheetah is not only the fastest land animal on Earth, but it's also probably about as fast as a land animal can be. It's had 4 billion years of evolution to kind of tinker with the design. And what you've come up with is this animal that is just really exquisitely designed for speed. It's really just like a marvel of biological engineering. And that's part of the reason why a cheetah is the most successful hunter out of all the big cats. It's also got a stronger bite pound for pound than a tiger. But half of the time, 50% of the time that a cheetah goes out looking for a kill, it's successful. And that is really, really unusual for a predator species, particularly a large predator species on Earth. And that speed and that ferocity and that bite strength, they mean that cheetah, if you were to encounter a cheetah in a dark alley on a rainy night, you would probably not fare very well. That cheetah would probably have the power, should it so desire, to kill you. And we can contrast that with this animal. This is an African wild dog. If you were to encounter a wild dog, it'd probably be much less fatal, not typically fatal to humans. But when I think about these two species together, it really raises a natural history mystery. And that is, why is it that when a 100-pound fierce cheetah meets a 15-pound or a 50-pound, cowardly dog, that the wild dog will eat while the cheetah retreats? Why is that? Why would a cheetah give up its kill to a lone wild dog? And the answer is that wild dogs have health care. And I'll explain that. So when a wild dog scraps with a cheetah, if it lives, it basically will go back to its pack and it will hang out with its pack. And when the pack makes a kill, even that injured wild dog will eat. After a while of doing that, it'll heal, and then it'll once again resume its duties as a meat procuring member of the pack. In nature, this is what healthcare looks like. Now, a cheetah, by contrast, has no pack. It's got no healthcare. If a cheetah were to kill a wild dog, even if it were just to sustain a minor injury, say the wild dog, bites it on the paw. So now it's slow. And now that 50% success rate plummets. And suddenly the cheetah can't make kills anymore. A slow cheetah is a dead cheetah. It'll slowly starve and die. And to be fair, I don't know whether this cheetah in particular is dead. It looks like it's just resting, and let's just hope that that's the case. So we have these solitary cheetahs versus a social wild dog. The advantage to the cheetah is that it doesn't have to share all of that meat. When it makes a kill, it can eat it unless something else steals it away. And so this idea of sociability in different species is really, really interesting. And what it really boils down to is, what will an animal sacrifice to help other animals that it has a connection to? And so when we think about that, let's think about family for a second. Let's think about ants, as in uncles and aunts. So an aunt will risk her life for a niece in human society. So why is that? We like to say that it's because the aunt loves the niece, right? And that's certainly true. But other species will also do this. And so the reason that they do it, whether we call it love or not, from an evolutionary perspective, is that a niece carries about 25% of the ant's genetic material, right? And so there's basically a cluster of genes inside the ant that is programmed to defend itself and to give itself the best chance to pass on to future generations. And a mother will accept an even greater risk because her children carry 50% of her genes. And even among a solitary animal like the cheetah, that they'll sacrifice themselves to save their young and pass on their DNA. But in many species, including the wild dog, they will sacrifice themselves to save an animal that is not related to them, that does not have that DNA connection. So why would one wild dog in a pack sacrifice its food or its safety or its time to defend another member of the pack? All right, so now we've got this very unusual situation, one that genetics can't entirely explain. And we see a very extreme example of sacrifice in ants. And this time we're talking about the actual insect. So an ant is strong, but it's of course no match for a spider or a grasshopper or a praying mantis. But a colony of ants, well, they can kill almost anything. Very, very resilient. And the reason that an ant colony is so successful is that it operates off of a single DNA blueprint. You have hundreds of thousands of daughters, each of which will sacrifice itself for any other ant. It's one cluster of genes defending itself. So which is a more successful survival strategy? Is it something social like the ant? Or is it something that is solitary, like the cheetah, that gets to eat everything that it kills? It's got perfect freedom and independence, right? So this map will tell the story on that pretty quickly. You can see everything in red here is the ants' distribution range. There are, according to the myrmecologist E.O. Wilson, there are 1 billion ants on Earth. That's a quadrillion ants. Ants have the highest biomass of any species on the planet. That means that if you were to weigh up all of the ants and put them on a scale, they would outweigh the sum of any other species, including humans, including blue whales, and certainly including cheetahs, which you can see are inset down here in Africa. These little colored patches, those are little populations of cheetahs. There's about 7,100 cheetahs in the world. So stack them up against the ant, they're not doing very well. All right, so now let's talk about humans. Another one of my favorite animals. Humans are really amazing in part because we can choose how social we want to be. Most animals don't have a choice. They're running basically on instinct. We can say, hey, we want to be social like the ant. We could be very solitary like the cheetah, or we can strike a middle ground. And different countries in the world and different communities have explored different paths along this role. Some countries go the route of the ant, and I'm thinking of authoritarian communist places like China or Russia, different points in history, where they follow this idea from each according to his ability, each according to his need. That's one extreme. Libertarians have a theory, and their theory is that human society is better at the opposite end of the spectrum, closer to the cheetah. All capitalism is best, to each according to his ability, needs be damned. And they've chosen this icon. This is a flag that they've come up with to represent their community. Don't tread on me. It's a picture of a porcupine. Porcupine's a very solitary animal, and it's off doing its own thing. And in their mind, a porcupine will not be aggressive, but if you provoke it and you attack it, it will act with a deadly, effective round of self-defense and leave you unhappy. So we'll put a pin in this, and let me just introduce myself. Hi, my name is Matt, Hongoltz Hetling, and you did a wonderful pronunciation job. Well done. 12 years ago, I was working as a merchandiser. So that meant that I was one of these guys that would show up at the supermarket at 6 in the morning, or maybe sometimes 5 in the morning. And my job would be to rearrange the shelves to accommodate new products. So if Lay's has a new jelly bean flavored potato chip, I gotta work off a little diagram I have to, maybe barbecue now only gets 3 rows instead of 4, and we get the jelly bean potato chip in there. It was miserable. It was just such a bad job. And I did it for $10 an hour. And sometimes when I did it, I was in physical pain because I had this recurring abscess deep in my jaw. Okay. And when the pain in my jaw got too bad, what I would do is I would take a thumbtack and I would heat it over a flame to sterilize. realize it. I would pull my back and then punch that thumbtack through the skin of my gums. So all the pus and the blood could spurt out, and then I wouldn't be in pain anymore. And then I'd be good for months. You know, sometimes I'd be good for 6, 7, 8 months before I had to go through that horror show again. And the reason that I did that instead of seeing a dentist was because I was an independent contractor, and I didn't have health care. I didn't live in a society that gave me health care in the same way that a pack of wild African dogs gives to itself. You know, I could eat, clearly I can eat, but I couldn't access any health care. And my employer, they weren't responsible for my health care either. Now, today, I'm doing a little bit better. I'm a journalist and an author, as you've heard. In this picture here, I'm talking to a traditional goat herder in Morocco. We did not share a common language, so she spoke to me with goats and flowers, which I quite liked. And I learned while I was there that Morocco also does not treat healthcare as a human right and does not protect its citizens in that way. Her health problems were likely much worse than my infected jaw. Now, 84% of Moroccans, by the way, have no health care. So I've written a book about libertarians, you know this, and held it up, The Libertarian Walks into a Bear. It's gotten me invited onto podcasts and talk shows and all sorts of media outlets to talk. And I find when I do this, that this book is really appealing to a very particular sort of person. That this book is appealing to a weird sort of person. And here you all are. And so this really struck me when I started that music contest that I talked about, the musician walks into a bear contest. And I asked people who wanted to participate to submit videos of themselves kind of explaining who they were as musicians, you know, to give the judges a feel for who they were. And so now I'm going to share with you one of those videos that I received.
Making it in the rap game is hard in 2020. Times are crazy, man. It's hard to cut through all the noise. My name's Tall Carl. I'm a rapper. I'm from Arnold, Missouri. A lot of my lyrical subject matter comes from the darkest places in my life. I've dealt with a lot of trauma, you know, and that's the only way I've been able to talk about it. When I was really young, I lost my twin brother in a load of laundry, and it tore my whole family apart. I was in a downward spiral for years until I met Short Greg. He's my promoter and my manager now. Turned my whole life around. Music is everything to me. I try to write every day. If I had to compare myself to another artist, it would probably be a combination of Jay Dilla, Sade, and I think definitely Igor Stravinsky. I think the musician walked into a bear competition is going to be an exciting challenge. Once I started reading the book, I couldn't put it down. Giving me a lot to draw on. There are a lot of talented musicians involved, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they come up with.
All right, so a libertarian walks into a bear, which you've probably come here to hear about. Now I've spent 20 minutes talking about complete nonsense. It is a true story. It is about an implementation of libertarian philosophy. Libertarians, you may know, stand for minimal government, low taxes, and regulations. They are cherishing, instead of those sorts of things, the idea of individual freedom and responsibility. And in 2004, libertarians had this problem that there's never been a modern nation ruled by libertarians. There hasn't even been a libertarian state or even a city. The closest thing on earth is Hong Kong, which does very well on average. It's an administrative region that's recognized as one of the most capitalistic places in the world. Got low taxation, it's got free trade. But even though it does well on average, you can see from this picture what the problem is. Some of the world's richest people live here, it's got the highest concentration of ultra high net worth individuals in the world. But it also has the largest, or one of the largest, income inequality measures in the entire world. And so you can see the shanty town. This is how most of the people live in Hong Kong. And so the libertarians don't necessarily look at Hong Kong as their standard bearer. They decided that they wanted to create something that was a little more pure, a little more small scale. They wanted to create a utopia. They wanted a shining jewel to show the world this is what libertarianism looks like. Proud cheetahs and porcupines living the free life. And so they were like, all right, well, where are we going to put this utopia? And it didn't take long for them to look at New Hampshire. Of course, New Hampshire is a live free or die state. It's got favorable taxes. You don't have to wear a seatbelt here. New Hampshire seemed just right. But what town should they consider? They decided they were going to do something called the Freetown Project, meaning that they were going to come and take over one town and turn it into this libertarian utopia. So they decided that they would kind of like interview different towns. So that they scoured 24 towns in New Hampshire, and one of the places that they considered was Grafton. So what does Grafton look like? This is a very nice, charming, bustling little burg. This is Grafton, Massachusetts, by the way. Here's Grafton, New Hampshire. You can see here, it's not quite as nice. They've got a town garage here. This is the town fire station with the red roof. Next to it, this house-looking thing is their entire town offices. And this little thing here that looks like an addition to the house, that's their police station. And that was a real victory for the police department, which operated without any police station at all for 82 years. Police chief had to take all his stuff home, do all his criminal investigations out of his living room. This is the only retail establishment that was in Grafton in 2004. It's the Grafton Country Store. You can see it's got some housing in back. And this is basically it. This was all that the town had. And it has since shut down, this retail store. So where is Grafton? Grafton, you can see here, is about a 15-hour walk from the Hooksett Public Library, 45 miles. And a bear could make that walk in much, much less than 15 hours. And there's one bear in the book that travels 1,000 miles over the course of a season. So this is nothing. This is one bear territory away from where you are. So in a very real and concrete sense, Grafton's bear problems are your bear problems. You know, those bears do not recognize town borders. So I first came to Grafton to talk to, I was working as a local reporter for the Valley News. Support your local journalism outlet, that's important. And I was sent to Grafton to interview a woman named Jessica Soul. She was a Vietnam War era veteran. She was having a problem with the VA, accessing some benefits as a veteran. She eventually became a member of the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies. This is what she looked like when I met her. She had become a virtual shut-in. And she called the newspaper because she wanted help getting the VA, or kind of pressuring the VA into making her home handicap accessible. And it's kind of like, chit-chatting about cats with her because she has cats and I like cats. And she says something like, oh yeah, I used to let them outside, but that was before the bears came. I thought, oh, well, that's, tell me more. Suddenly the VA does not sound nearly as interesting as what you just said there. And she told me about how the bear activity around her home had led to her self-confinement. 2 kittens were snatched from her backyard. A bear tried to force its way into her home from the back porch, and another met her on her front ramp while she tried to get to her mailbox. And when she's telling me these bear stories, I couldn't believe it. I was like, what happened in Grafton? Why is this happening? And I started talking to other people in the neighborhood, and they also are telling me all these outlandish um, bear stories. And so what I found out was that uh, there's two unusual things in Grafton. One was this unusual bear activity. The other was the Freetown Project. And I started to see how this was really one and the same story. So you can see here, these are a few of the folks who helped get the Freetown Project rolling. They selected Grafton. This up here on the top right here, this is John Babiars. He has run for governor of New Hampshire multiple times on the Libertarian ticket. He's also Grafton's fire chief. This is his wife, Rosalie. And in 2004, a few guys representing the Freetown movement came to meet with John in this firehouse. And they asked him, a little bit about Grafton, and his answers, and I should say their answers, made them choose Grafton as the right place. This on the bottom right, these two pictures are the same person. This is Bob Hull. He is a businessman from New Jersey, and he had quite a bit of money, so he was kind of financing a lot of the Freetown, and he eventually went on to serve in the New Hampshire legislature. This is another Freetown founder. His name is Tony Lekas. He was a firearms instructor, native New Hampshireite, and also went on to serve in the state legislature. This man here, you can't see him that well. It says on that's a mug sheet, a rap sheet, a mug shot, right? That's how you say it, right? It says his name is Lawrence Edward Pendarvis, Larry Pendarvis, but he didn't tell anyone that was his name when he came to Grafton. He said that his name was Zach Bass, and that might be because he had been convicted of 132 counts of child pornography in his home state of Florida. And the conviction was overturned on a courtroom technicality, a prosecutorial error. But these were the folks who came to Grafton right off the bat, and they started this, and they built this website to describe the project. And the website had all these outlandish ideas in it. They said, we're going to come to Grafton and assert our right to have junk cars on the property, which people can sympathize with, and to engage in consensual cannibalism, which not so much. That they advocated for the right to traffic drugs and the right to traffic organs. That they advocated for the right to have duels to settle their disputes, or the right to organize bum fights, which is when you pay an indigent person to have a fist fight for your pleasure and amusement by offering them some amount of money that is meaningful to them in their vulnerable state and society. And, they weren't actually necessarily interested in doing all these things, but in their philosophy, all of these things made sense and were kind of like, should come up to individual decisions rather than be dictated by the state. And so they pick Grafton. They say, Grafton seems perfect. They started to move to Grafton. Grafton, one of the big things that they liked about Grafton was it had no zoning laws. And so that meant that they could live however they wanted to live. They didn't have to meet any basic fire recommendations or guidelines in order to establish a domicile. So they started to live in odd living situations in the woods. They would live in trailers or yurts or mobile homes or shipping containers, even makeshift cabins and tents. And all this kind of like chain of armed encampments started to grow in the woods. And they were populated almost exclusively by men and young men. These were folks who could just kind of pick up on a moment's notice and move to a random town in New Hampshire that had no employment, which meant that they were, generally speaking, kind of rootless. So One of the early things they did when they came to Grafton involved this. This is the town's best historic asset. It's called the Grafton Center Meeting House, also known as the Grafton Church. You can see it's a very nice example of the traditional New England steeple church. It was built in 1798, and it's really a sacred place in Grafton at this time. This is where, for hundreds of years, generations and generations of Graftonites and their parents and their grandparents had come to be baptized. It's where they had come to get married. It's where they'd come to be memorialized after their death. So really, really sacred place. However, there was a guy who, I should getting ahead of myself, named John Cannell. He was a retired factory worker from Stahl Chemical down near Boston. And he came up and he bought this church for $68,000 because the town was so tax conscious that it didn't want to assume the financial risk of owning that building. And so when it went on the market, they didn't intercede. They actually turned down an offer to take that building for free. And instead, it was purchased by a Freetowner for $68,000. Well, he moved into that building, set up residence inside it. He had no religious training, but he declared that he was the pastor and founder of a new church that he was going to call the Peaceful Assembly Church. And he immediately got into a fight with the town over whether he would have to pay taxes on this church. Because, if it's a church, then you don't have to pay taxes on it. But the town wasn't convinced that it was a church. And they said, all right, you sound a little bit more like you might be a secular political organization. Why don't you get nonprofit status from the IRS? That'll bolster your case. And John Cannell said, well, that's a problem because I don't recognize the IRS as a legal taxing authority. I'm a libertarian and they're government thugs. I can't interact with them freely. And so they started to fight over this. So what other changes did the Freetowners make in the town of Grafton? For this social experiment, America's first free town? Well, they basically fought against every tax dollar in town. Every municipal expenditure was argued against. And so they cut municipal services. The planning board budget was reduced by 95%. The police department, the fire department, the road department all had their budgets tightly constrained. The town culture as a whole was shifting towards a place of less sacrifice, place that was much more like cheetahs and porcupines. So what was the result of these changes that they made? Let's put that aside for just a second and talk about bears. So a bear is a very fearsome creature, right? Aside from everything that we throw on its shoulders in an anthropomorphic sense, they can bend a car door in half. That's a fact. People don't make that up. A bear is super fast, much faster than a person. It could spot the world's fastest man, Usain Bolt, 25 meters in a 100-meter dash and still catch him before the finish line. But they're also very timid. There have been no attacks at the time the Freetown Project began in the state of New Hampshire for 150 years. And that's because over the years, bears have learned not to mess with people. They're very smart. Bears have, unlike a lot of animals that fly pretty much on instinct, bears run on a lot of gray matter. They're problem solvers. Charles Darwin, in his book on evolution, talks about this example of an amazingly smart bear to him that was in a zoo in, I think, Poland, that saw, kind of like there's a little stream running past its cage, and it saw a piece of bread floating down the stream. And so it splashed the water towards itself to alter the current, to redirect the bread to come to a place where it could grab it. And that's really genius in the animal world. And it's a really good example of how smart bears are. Ben Killam, our local resident world famous bear expert from Lyme, New Hampshire, he says that bears can count to 12. great apes can only count to 3 or 4. So if that's true, bears are really some of the smartest animals out there. They're smarter than your average animal, one might say. Ben Killam says that they can also work out adoption schemes where if one mother bear can't give food to its young because its local territory doesn't have a lot of food, that it can go to a neighboring bear that it might have like a familial connection with in another territory that has more food and arrange for that bear to take on the rearing of her cub. So really, really smart social problem solvers. But what this problem solving capability they have means is that they are also opportunists. And in Grafton, bears suddenly had, thanks to the Freetown Project, some new opportunities. This is how human culture can affect an animal culture. All of those encampments in the woods, the tents and the yurts and all that, they were all managing their food in their own way. And they were also managing their food waste in their own way. And so what that meant is suddenly there were calories that were up for grabs. Not only that, but the Freetowners, when a problem bear started to show itself or become known to them, you or I might react to a problematic bear by calling Fish and Game or some other authority and saying, triggering a response where an expert might come and figure out what's going on and resolve that bear problem, either by telling a neighbor to pull in a bird feeder or cover up a barbecue grill, or even by euthanizing or relocating the bear. Freetowners didn't like that. They don't want to turn to state government to solve their problems. And so they were much more likely, when a problem bear came up, to try to deter it on their own terms. And so there's this weird patchwork set of bear deterrents happening. They would put cayenne pepper. One guy put cayenne pepper in his garbage so that the bear would get a snoot full of pepper and then run away. Other people set booby traps for the bears. Other people threw firecrackers at the bears' heads. Other people use electric fences, or I don't know, all sorts of, would just play the radio loud. And so all of these non-lethal kind of gentle methods of bear deterrence, combined with all of the food and the food waste that were now suddenly available for the bears, started to alter the bears' behavior. And so you had people unintentionally training the bears to associate humans with food. And then also, you had people who asserted their right to feed the bears intentionally for the joy of watching them eat. There's a woman that I talk about in the book named Donut Lady. Donut Lady would go out every day at 8 a.m. carrying 2 big buckets of grain topped with sugared donuts from the market basket. And there would be a pack of bears waiting for her in her backyard. And when you go out, I don't know if you've ever fed like 8 dogs at once, how they all kind of like crowd the plate because they all want first dibs. That's what it was like when Donut Lady would feed 8 bears at once. They would be, kind of like jostling for the best position. And these bears were so well fed that they didn't even hibernate. They came out all winter long. And Donut Lady is a senior. And so I started thinking about it. I said, so you're going out there on the slick, icy ground, carrying these big, heavy things. Aren't you afraid that you would fall on the ice in the middle of all the bears? And she said, I fell down all the time. It was no big deal. And maybe she was one of these special people who could navigate the dangers of feeding a wild animal, a big, powerful wild animal successfully forever. But certainly the possibility for danger was there. So you have intentional feeders training the bears. So this all came to a head during the Freetown Project with this woman. Her name is Tracy Colburn. Tracy lives in a mobile home in Grafton. She was not a Freetowner. She was not a gun owner. She was just kind of like a woman living her life. She had this dog named Kai. One night she was uh, letting Kai out at about 10 o'clock at night to pee. And when she opened her door, the porch, which you can see in the background, was, in her words, just full of bear. And there were 3 bears on her porch. And 2 of them were probably grown cubs. They took off. Kai launched himself at the 3rd bear. And so now suddenly her dog here is fighting this bear on her porch. And Tracy, if you've ever heard advice on how to deal with a bear, probably the advice has been, if it's a black bear, you want to scare him off. You want to show him who's boss. And so you don't want to seem too vulnerable. So Tracy stood on her porch and she screamed at the bear. But the bear was kind of pinned down by the dog. And so instead of running away, it perceived Tracy's scream as a mortal threat. And it charged Tracy and it attacked her. And it was almost as if, it got her most vulnerable spot. You can see the bandages on her wrist. She looks like a suicide attempt. It cut her wrist so badly that she was in very, very real danger of bleeding out. Clearly, she did not bleed out, but she found herself isolated in this town and didn't have a cell phone, didn't have not a working cell phone because cell phones don't work in Grafton. She didn't have a working landline. And so she really, once she got away from the bear and into her house, she was really in a very life-threatening situation that I describe in a little more detail in the book. Other impacts in Grafton. This is what happened to the Grafton Church, that beautiful sacred place where all those generations had gone to for their spiritual well-being. It tragically burned down. And even worse than the loss of the church was the fact that when it burned down, John Cannell, our factory worker who bought it and tried to operate it as his own kind of church, he died in the fire. The authorities have not ruled on whether it was an arson or an accident, which often means that they are just kind of hoping someone will step forward. But that was a very sad situation. You can see here's side by side of what the Freetown Project did to this precious building before and after. This is the aftermath of a road rage incident in Grafton. I took this picture from the Valley News where I used to work. And what happened was they were kind of like doing typical like stopping, starting to piss each other off on the road. And they stopped and the 2 guys got out and they started, yelling at each other. And big guy punched the little guy. Little guy was a Free Stater and he had a gun and he shot the big guy in the stomach. Both of them had young children in the car. So this is another impact of what happens when you lionize this idea of individuals taking matters into their own hands. There were more impacts. Neighbor complaints went up, recycling rates went down, the number of registered sex offenders went up, the town's legal expenses went up because it kept getting sued. County authorities found a meth lab in the town. And even though Grafton had never seen a murder in living memory, during the Freetown Project, one resident called her roommate a freeloader, became the victim of the first murder in living memory because he shot her. That was followed immediately by the second murder when he shot his other roommate. So this is April Rogers. She does not live in Grafton. She lives in the neighboring town of Grafton. 71 years old, woke up she, like Tracy, lived alone in a mobile home, vulnerable population, wakes up 3 in the morning and she hears something in her kitchen. So she goes out in a wheelchair to investigate, and there's a bear in her kitchen. She didn't make the mistake that Tracy made. She said, I'm going to just sit here quietly, unassuming, and not stir the pot and just let the bear do what it wants to do, and then it'll leave. And the bear came over and sat down next to her, and apparently it felt trapped in her kitchen with her. And in her words, she said, "It just let me have it." And this is what the bear did to April. She says that it just kind of ripped the side of her face down, her skull. She's very, very lucky to have survived and to have been able to resume some semblance of normal life. But she wasn't even in Grafton. She was the next town over. So when you train a population of bears to react to people in a certain way, you're not necessarily going to be held accountable for that in any real way. And yet those downstream impacts of bad bear behavior continue on. So remember I said there had not been a bear attack in New Hampshire for 150 years. Now you've got 2 of them in neighboring towns. And there was a 3rd attack since I've written the book. It was much less serious, but a guy on a hot summer night was taking an air conditioner out of his pickup truck. Bear just attacked him from behind. He didn't even know it was there until he felt its claws on his back. And he was a robust guy, was able to scare the bear away with only very minor injuries. But so now we've got a 3rd bear attack, all in this little corner of the state. So humans are the only animals that have the power to choose what we'll sacrifice for others. Only in a free democratic society like America can we as citizens exercise that power, decide if we want to be social or solitary, want to decide whether we want to make sacrifices as individuals or through a government structure. And I understand the appeal of rugged individualism, but I found through my research that the impact can be quite severe. And I've also learned that bears are best managed through collective action and strategies. That means rules that are enforced and on the books about waste keeping, and experts helping to resolve problems when they arise, among other potential policies that we can enact. So the Freetown Project ended in 2016. I did find signs of life in Grafton. I found hope in their public library. You can see how beautiful this library is. That is because it is Grafton, Massachusetts' library. Here's the Grafton Library. It's a little more modest. You can see the porta potty here on the side, which I had to use many times. Because the Freetown Project choked the library's budget so effectively, they were only, when I was researching this book, I wanted to go use their library to look at their town records and stuff. They were only open during the work week on Wednesday mornings from 9 to 12, 3 hours, 3 hours a week. And I would go there and I would talk with the librarian, who was lovely, and use the porta potty, which is cracked and had been inherited from the rec department like 9 years previous. Yet, even as rundown as it was, oh, and I'll also mention they had to really fight. At one point, the Freetowners suggested that they run on volunteers. Let's stop paying the staff of the library. And they were told, well, under New Hampshire state law, that's illegal. If it's a public library, you got to have paid staff running it. That's the law. And they said, all right, well, maybe we could just pay them $1 an hour. How'd that be? So they didn't manage to do that. But the library's budget, make no doubt about it, was under attack. And they've had a very difficult time thriving. And yet, when I was there, I would see that kind of like nascent seed of civic life, civic responsibility. And so I would urge you all to support your local library. That is very, very important. And so I think that's it. I've gone a little bit longer than I intended to, but I would love to hear questions. And if folks are willing to stay, if there are questions to be answered, I am very happy to answer them to go a little bit past, if we want to go to 8:05 or 8:10 or so.
Thank you. Thank you for your willingness. And anyone who has a question, if you'd like to pop it in the chat or unmute yourself and please ask away.
Maybe I've said it all.
No, the book says it all.
Well, Anne, I know one question you had was about that church. So we'll let folks think about questions for a second. And people want to know what happened to the church. And I'm happy to say that after the book was published, a group called the Mascoma Valley Preservation, a civic-minded nonprofit, has taken over responsibility for the church. And they have done a lot of fundraising to try to put that church back in some sort of working order. And I believe they plan to do it as kind of like a farmer's market, entrepreneurial incubator type space, something that will serve the community and bolster it up, which I think is a fantastic vision. They've done fundraising. They auctioned off a copy of my book. They applied for grants. The grants, they got $300,000. My book, they got $28. So I'm very happy that I did that. Makes me feel very good about myself. But they are, they do seem to be on a path towards restoring that building. So I'm very, very happy to report that.
Good. Someone asked in the chat, can you speak about the Free State Project? I know we spoke briefly about it before people came in.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the Free State Project is not the same as the Freetown Project, but they were kind of running in parallel with similar goals. The Free State Project doesn't want to take any responsibility for the nonsense that unfolded in Grafton. And perhaps they shouldn't have to directly. But in 2016, the Free State Project did what's called triggering. And that meant that 20,000 people who they had signed up from all across the country were triggered and were meant to come to New Hampshire and start trying to impact state goals and state policy and state culture in the same way, to turn the whole state into a more libertarian community, or more utopian libertarian culture on display. And that, ironically, is what killed the Freetown Project, because once libertarians were being told that they could come to New Hampshire and choose any community to live in, Grafton no longer became like the de facto landing spot for people who wanted to be a part of something bigger and feel like they were doing this kind of big, amazing idea thing. And so very few of them chose Grafton anymore, because why would you? It was beshitted by bears, right? They were much more likely to go to a place like Keene, which still had robust municipal services and a nice library and tennis courts and a Main Street with businesses on it that benefited from a municipal infrastructure like roads and sewer. And so the Free State Project is still going on. It hasn't had a huge, like, flashy effect, but it's certainly had an effect. You can find Free Staters behind, for example, the legislation that made flying cars legal in the state of New Hampshire, among many other things. So they are here, they are working actively, and they probably live in Hooksett. I'm quite sure that at least some of them are there and actively trying to do what they can to make the world how they want the world to be.
Someone else asked, are the groups still active? I think the groups that were originally in Grafton?
They've basically died out. They always kind of relied on a steady stream of incomers to replace those who kind of got sick of it and left, because they were kind of rootless people. So the individuals are still there. Many of them have gone on to other parts of the state. One guy who's in the book, Tom Ploget, he was elected to the state legislature this year as a Republican. Yeah, so they're definitely still there and active, but the Freetown Project itself is no more.
Thank you. Another question, has there been any signs of positive changes in the bears' behavior since 2016? I
would say it's really hard to measure, right? who's out there with a calculator toting up bear behaviors, right? But that being said, I think that the third attack, which just happened last year, demonstrates that the bears in that pocket of the state are still too aggressive. And while the Freetown Project itself has gone, that culture of rugged individualism remains strong in Grafton and in various other places throughout the state. And so I think the problems that I described in the book are likely to continue. Perhaps they won't be quite so concentrated in Grafton itself, but I think I'd be very surprised if 5 years went by and we did not see another bear attack. And at some point, one of those bear attacks is going to be fatal. And so it really is like, it's funny, but it's also like there's a tone of seriousness there. Like this is really life and death for somebody.
And another person asked, is New Hampshire the only free state or focus? I think that was the goal of the project. And
yeah. I mean,
critical mass.
There have been other efforts at libertarian utopian communities. Loving County, Texas got rolling for a little while, but the locals there pushed them out very aggressively. They tried to take over islands and been turned back by the nations that already own those islands. And so I think New Hampshire is really it, though. New Hampshire has been described to me as the greatest concentration of libertarians in the world. And so if you want to be a libertarian and do something to change the world, this is where you're coming.
Okay. There were also a couple other comments in the chat about dogs, just being out if you live in the woods and your dogs. That is a very real possibility. I thought it was interesting in your book, you talk about coyotes being more robust here than they are in other places. And then someone mentioned, you talk about potentially underlying issues of disease in the bears from eating human garbage. We forget that there are impacts on the animals, beyond the attacks on humans.
Yeah. It's funny. Both of those comments really are very tightly related in my mind because, they're both examples of how humans. There's this emerging field called Anthro Zoology, right? And it's the idea. It's like anthropology, but it's not quite so human-centric. It kind of acknowledges that we're different species evolving in a place, taking advantage, of the same resources and impacting each other. And our coyote hybrids are a direct result of the fact that we killed all the wolves here. And so now coyotes come, they can occupy a different niche in our ecosystem. And that kind of underscores the idea that like the nature that we see is not really at all pristine. It's a reflection of the humans who live there, or at least it's certainly impacted by the humans who live there. And we've impacted bear culture in all sorts of ways. Bears aren't really nocturnal when there's no people around, but here they are because people are, driving them into those sorts of habits. Bears are more twitchy. They're more likely to have genetically inherited diseases because we've bottlenecked their genetics. They've gone through population bottlenecks that make them more likely to inherit hereditary diseases. And what the comment may have been getting at was I go on in the book about the idea that bears in the Grafton area in particular might be suffering from something called toxoplasmosis, which is a infection from a parasite called T. gondii. And basically, this parasite has the capability to alter the behavior of its mammalian hosts, and it makes them greater risk takers. And it does this because in its natural life cycle, it basically wants to convince a rat to go back to a cat. That's how the parasite reproduces. And when it infects a bear, it might make that bear more aggressive and more fearless. And by the way, when it infects a person, that person can be more aggressive and more fearless as well. And there have been some really interesting population level studies that show that a human population with a high degree of toxoplasmosis will express that in different ways. Like they're just bigger risk taking. So more driving accidents for high-speed drivers, more entrepreneurial efforts because they want to go start more businesses. Really fascinating stuff.
Wow. I read recently about archaeogeneticists, and I was like,
oh, what's that?
Archaeology with genes, and how that is just another subject matter that I haven't spent much time thinking about yet. Yep. Anything else before we let Matt go? Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been fascinating. And I highly recommend the book. It's available in a variety of formats here at the library. You can download it to listen to. There is a small hold list because Matt is making quite the round of New Hampshire libraries. I know there are some others in our community, the G-Notes Consortium, that are looking forward to having you.
So thankful that you all came to listen for so long. Thank you so much. I will play us out with another video. But if, yeah, I don't know if anybody has anything else that they'd like to ask me, you can always find me on Twitter where I'm at HH_Matt, or shoot me an email. I'm always happy to hear what people think of my book. I'm a first-time author, which means that I'm frantically sweating Amazon comments all day, every day.
We look forward to your next project.
Thank you very much, Ann. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone. Have a good evening. Good night.